Hi, my name is Amy Bergquist. I'm Senior Staff Attorney at the Advocates for Human Rights, and I'm also a Vice President of the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty. The Advocates for Human Rights is on the steering committee of the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty, and in that capacity, we provide support to members of the coalition around the world who want assistance in building their capacity to engage in advocacy at the United Nations. This video is one of a series of video trainings for coalition members who want to expand their capacity to engage with United Nations human rights mechanisms. The focus of this video is the Universal Periodic Review. In this training video, we'll talk a little bit about the UPR in general and the UPR cycle. Then we'll talk about the interactive dialogue, what happens in the lead up to that and during the interactive dialogue. And then we'll focus on opportunities for your organization to engage in advocacy around the UPR. So as a refresher, the Universal Periodic Review is a charter-based human rights mechanism at the United Nations, and it applies to every UN member state. Every UN member state, every 5 years, goes through the Universal Periodic Review, and the focus of the UPR is the interactive dialogue, which is a 3.5-hour period of time when the Human Rights Council meets in a session called the Working Group of the Universal Periodic Review. The government of the state under review sends a delegation to Geneva to sit in the front of the room to present their report about what the country has done over the last 5 years to improve human rights. And then all the UN member states have the chance to contribute to the interactive dialogue, to make comments about what has been going on in that country, to praise the government for things it's done well, to criticize the government for things it hasn't done so well, and most important, to make recommendations about what should happen over the next 5 years. As you'll recall, the Human Rights Council is a political body. So the Universal Periodic Review is a state-driven process. It's a peer review process, and it's diplomats making recommendations to the state under review. The country under review has the choice then, with the recommendations it receives, to either accept them or to note them. And the United Nations reuses the term note instead of reject, which sounds a bit harsh for the diplomats at the United Nations, I guess. Here's the cycle for the Universal Periodic Review. And you'll see at stage 1 is preparation of information for the review. The government is compiling its own national report, and at the same time, stakeholders, meaning civil society organizations, universities, National Human Rights Institution, they are also preparing their own stakeholder reports. And you may have participated in a stakeholder report at some time in the past for the UPR of your country. The World Coalition often coordinates these stakeholder reports, and the Advocates for Human Rights often provides pro bono support for members of the coalition that need help with drafting those stakeholder reports. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights takes all of those stakeholder reports and the NHRI reports and summarizes them in a more concise document, and also provides a compilation of relevant information from the various United Nations bodies that touch on human rights. So that's stage 1 of the process, and there's an obvious opportunity for NGOs to get involved by writing stakeholder reports and by engaging with the government if it holds consultations with civil society in the preparation of its own report. The second stage in the UPR cycle is the interactive dialogue itself. That's that 3.5-hour period that I mentioned just before. And the interactive dialogue is the chance for UN member states to make oral recommendations to the government. The recommendations that are delivered orally are then reduced to writing in a document called the Report of the Working Group, and that contains verbatim all of the recommendations that were made orally during that interactive dialogue. And this draft report, which typically comes out 2 or 3 days after the interactive dialogue, might be divided into different categories of recommendations that enjoy the support of the state under review, recommendations that the state under review notes because it doesn't accept them, and perhaps some recommendations that the state under review needs more time to think about. So that's what happens during the interactive dialogue and in the few days after the interactive dialogue. Now, between steps 1 and steps 2, there are opportunities for civil society organizations to get involved in advocacy, which we'll talk about more in a little bit. But after that report comes out, that's sort of the official final version of the recommendations that are issued, and it's up to the government under review then to decide what to do with those recommendations. For some of the recommendations, the government knows right away and it can decide on the spot. We're going to accept those, we're going to note those. But in many cases, governments will defer decision on all of the recommendations or on some of the recommendations, and they have until the next Human Rights Council session. So typically they have about 3 or 4 months to give their formal response to the recommendations they received during the interactive dialogue. So that Human Rights Council session is at stage 3 of the cycle you see, and that's the adoption of the report of the working group for the Universal Periodic Review. So the adoption of the outcomes is when the government gives its official response to the recommendations received, typically in a document called an addendum, and it might simply list the recommendations by number and say accepted or noted, or it might give an explanation of what the government's position is on the particular human rights issue. And then the Human Rights Council in a plenary session will consider the working group and the addendum, and a government delegation may return to Geneva to give some final thoughts about the UPR process. UN member states again can speak, and at this stage NGOs are allowed to deliver oral statements at the Human Rights Council, and then formally the council will adopt the working group report and the Universal Periodic Review will be concluded. And then we move on to stage 4, which is really the most important, which is implementation of recommendations. After the state has made the commitments to accept certain recommendations, it has until the next UPR begins to implement. And it's an opportunity for civil society organizations to lobby the government to do a good job on implementing those recommendations, and to consult with civil society organizations about how best to implement them. In some cases, the United Nations or other member states might provide financial and technical assistance for implementation. And it's also a time for non-governmental organizations to document and monitor implementation to see what steps the government is taking to implement the recommendations it committed to implement by the time of the adoption of the report. And then the cycle begins again as the civil society organizations and the government compile their information for the next Universal Periodic Review. So the cycle repeats itself. So that's an overview of the Universal Periodic Review and what to expect at each stage, and how an overview of how civil society organizations can be involved with the process. Now, looking at that cycle, you may say, well, we missed that deadline. We didn't submit a stakeholder report. Do we have to now wait 5 years until the next UPR stakeholder report deadline? And the answer is certainly not. It's always good to submit a stakeholder report, and the Advocates for Human Rights stands ready to help you if there's a stakeholder report deadline coming up. But if you missed that deadline, please do not despair. There's still a lot that you can do to take advantage of the UPR mechanism to advocate for abolition of the death penalty in your country. So don't worry about it, but if that deadline is coming up, feel free to reach out for assistance in getting that stakeholder report done. The heart of the UPR is, as I mentioned, the interactive dialogue. This is that 3.5-hour period where a delegation from the government of the country under review comes to Geneva, sits before the Human Rights Council, and delivers statements. And here you see a screenshot from the UPR of the Maldives, which took place in 2015. The Maldives is getting ready right now for its next UPR because it's 5 years later. So what can you expect during this interactive dialogue? You'll expect an opening statement by the government, and the government may, in that opening statement, give a broad overview, may talk about certain things the government is proud of that it has accomplished, and it may also respond to questions that the government has received or questions the government anticipates receiving. Oftentimes one member of the delegation is the leader of the delegation, and they will hand off to other members of the delegation to deal with specific issues that other members of the delegation specialize in. An important part of leading up to the interactive dialogue is the opportunity of all UN member states to submit questions in advance of the interactive dialogue. These questions can really help frame the discussion and put the state under review on notice that countries at the Human Rights Council are really eager to hear about these particular issues. So some countries under review will dedicate significant time to preparing their responses to these advanced questions. I have on the screen in front of you some questions that were submitted in advance by Norway and Slovenia for the 2015 UPR of the Maldives. And you can see that they have quite detailed, pointed questions on issues including the death penalty and issues including gender-based discrimination and other topics, the safety of human rights defenders and journalists. And so these questions are all submitted and shared with the state under review in advance of the 3.5-hour session. And one thing that civil society organizations can do is engage in advocacy to encourage states to pose questions in advance to the state under review so as to focus some attention on the issue before the 3.5-hour session begins. The actual interactive dialogue, as I said, takes about 3.5 hours, and it is all live webcast on UN Web TV. So even if you can't go to Geneva, it can be very fun and educative to watch the interactive dialogue on UN Web TV if you have internet access. And as in terms of what to expect, countries have to subscribe or inscribe in advance to say whether they want to speak. So they will sign up in advance with the OHCHR staff to say, I want to speak about the Maldives, for example. And after that subscription list has closed, the staff will determine we have 3.5 hours, we're allocating a certain amount of time for the state party to deliver its statements, and here's our remaining time. And they will divide up that remaining time among the countries that have signed up to speak. So if a country has a lot of other UN member states very concerned about the human rights condition in the country, there might be a very long list of countries. It could be over 100 countries that want to speak. In other countries that don't garner as much attention, it might be just 60 or 70 countries that have signed up to speak. So depending on the popularity of the country or the notoriety of human rights issues in the country, the individual countries may have as little as 55 seconds to speak or as much as 2 minutes to speak to deliver their interventions. Now, in terms of how it works, in terms of the speaking order, they will list all the countries alphabetically that have signed up to speak, but they will start at a random point in the alphabet. So here you can see starting with the V's on this stage of the screen, and then once it gets down to Yemen, they start over in the alphabet with Afghanistan. So they don't always start with the A's and go to Z. Sometimes they will start they'll always start at a different part of the alphabet for each UPR. But you know all of this in advance, and then if you have the list of the speakers that have signed up, you can sort of follow in advance knowing which countries are scheduled to speak, and they go down the list with each country delivering its statement, and then they'll take a break from the interventions and give the state party under review a chance to respond. So they'll respond to questions that have been posed, to specific issues that have been raised, to specific recommendations or areas of focus for different countries that have intervened. And the process goes on over the 3.5 hours. So every country that's signed up to speak gets their chance to speak, and the government gets a chance to respond to the interventions and to make a closing statement at the end of the 3.5-hour period. So that's what to expect. If you're not watching live in real time on UN Web TV, the tech support folks in Geneva are pretty quick at posting the video on the UN Web TV archives, usually the same day. So you can go back and then you can click chapter through chapter to listen to what a specific country had to say about during the interactive dialogue. I highly recommend that you choose your settings for available languages English. Otherwise, you'll listen to the original language. And unless you're fluent in all of the UN member languages, it might be confusing to listen to all of the interventions in their original languages. So why should you bother engaging with the Universal Periodic Review. After all, I've said it's a political mechanism. The governments can reject all of the recommendations. So why should you get involved? Well, first of all, it's an international forum, and it's always good to raise death penalty issues and related issues with an international forum. It's important to shine that international spotlight on a country's retentionist death penalty practices. It's also a way to raise awareness, both domestically and internationally, about the particular death penalty issues that your organization is focusing on or concerned about. The UPR mechanism is also an opportunity for you as a civil society organization to build relationships with the governments of the recommending states. It's a way for you to reach out to these friendly states, states that support abolition of the death penalty, and build bridges with them. And that can be fruitful for all sorts of efforts later on. It can also be useful to build up the quantity of recommendations. So it can be really powerful to say there were 15 recommendations at the Universal Periodic Review. There were 15 countries that recommended that Sierra Leone abolish the death penalty or ratify the optional protocol to the second optional protocol to the ICCPR. So those quantity of recommendations can also be a good talking point and a good way to show the scope, the breadth of international support for abolition. You can also think of the quality of recommendations as an important focus point for why the UPR mechanism is important. So while a lot of countries will simply recommend abolition or a formal moratorium or ratification of the second optional protocol, you can also think strategically about what other types of recommendations would be useful in the context of your country. So for example, looking at Japan, we know that from its past performance in the Universal Periodic Review, it often will say we keep the death penalty because the public in Japan support the death penalty. There's public support for it, and therefore we as members of government feel like we need to retain the practice. So strategically, one of the things that the World Coalition members supported as a recommendation, and it was a recommendation that a government made, was to engage in a public awareness raising campaign about the death penalty. Because if the government of Japan is going to say we rely on the public for its support of the death penalty, then the government shouldn't shy away from educating the public and making sure the public knows about the death penalty. So that was an important quality recommendation for the UPR of Japan. Similarly, for the United States, one of the recommendations we have advocated for is to push for transparency about the sources of drugs that are used in lethal injections, because oftentimes they are sourced because of the European Union's restrictions on exports of drugs that can be used to kill people and other products that can be used to kill people. The state authorities are often sourcing these drugs from really sketchy sources. So we wanted to make sure that people who are scheduled to be executed by lethal injection have access to full information about where the drugs are coming from, who manufactured them, etc. So we did receive a recommendation in the last UPR of the United States about transparency of drug sourcing and ensuring that the drugs are sourced from approved vendors rather than from sort of back alley sources. So quality of recommendations can be very important. Another reason to bother with the UPR is that the state under review is on the record. They are making statements in front of the entire world at the Human Rights Council about a variety of human rights issues. So it can be really valuable to have some government official on the record speaking about what its rationale is for retaining the death penalty or not abolishing the death penalty. That can be really valuable also. Accepted recommendations are also, of course, really valuable if the government accepts a recommendation that's relevant for your efforts toward abolition of the death penalty. Then that gives you a chance to open the door with the government and say, you accepted this recommendation, now let's work and do our next steps to help implement the recommendation over the next 5 years. And then, of course, implementation is a really important piece. Partnering between the government and civil society to help the government keep its promises, and then also the role of civil society in monitoring and holding the government accountable for the promises it makes in the UPR. So those are all different reasons that it's useful to engage with the UPR mechanism. There's a study, rather dated now, but a study that UPR Info NGO based in Geneva did of the UPR mechanism, and they found that of 66 UPRs, that 40% of all recommendations triggered some positive action on the part of states. And even the rejected or noted recommendations in some cases triggered action. So this pressure from the UN member states can really move countries toward change. One example they gave was that the United Arab Emirates, the government set up a new human rights department at its Ministry of Foreign Affairs. In Mauritius, there was a provision in the law that prescribed wages on a gendered basis, and they removed that. I can give an example from one of the Advocates for Human Rights partner organizations, and that's Croatia. Right before Croatia's second Universal Periodic Review, the government of Croatia had repealed its law that criminalized domestic violence. And there was a lot of outrage, a lot of pressure, and a lot of recommendations in the UPR during the interactive dialogue to reinstate that law. And lo and behold, just a few months later, the government of Croatia reinstated that law. Parliament readopted the law so that they again recriminalized domestic violence. So the UPR can be a successful tool in pushing for change in various countries. One of the things that we'll talk about in more detail in another training is making smart recommendations. For civil society organizations that want to make the most of the UPR, you want to be very careful in your crafting of recommendations that you are going to suggest to the delegates to the Human Rights Council. And this SMART acronym is one that's used commonly in a lot of different fields to help you think about what makes for a good recommendation. Now, a good recommendation in the context of the UPR, just like in a lot of other contexts, is specific. It gives the country something specific that it can accomplish, such as ratify the second optional protocol to the ICCPR. That's very specific, very concrete action. Another good characteristic of a recommendation is that it's measurable. How can you tell whether it's been done or not? Ratifying the second optional protocol to the ICCPR is pretty clear. Did they ratify it? Did they deposit the instruments of ratification? Has that been done? It's either yes or no. It's been done or it hasn't been done. Now, taking a different example, it might be commuting the death sentences of every person on death row. So to measure that, you would look at how many people are currently under sentence of death, and then in 5 years' time, you would expect none of those people to be under sentence of death later on. So it's something that you can measure. The A in SMART recommendations is whether something is achievable. And this doesn't mean like whether it's politically acceptable. It means like, is this something that practically could be achievable in the next 5 years? Is this something that could get done? So eliminating the death penalty for drug-related offenses, that's something that's within Parliament's power to adopt that law. It's something that could be concretely achieved. Is it relevant? Is the recommendation something that is useful, relevant, helpful? And if you're a civil society organization, I'm presuming that you're going to be suggesting relevant recommendations. And then the time-bound feature is sort of baked into the UPR mechanism because the UPR happens every 5 years. So the assumption with all UPR recommendations is that you will do it within the next 5 years before you come to the next interactive dialogue. So that's just a quick overview of SMART recommendations, which we'll get into in more detail in another video training. One thing that's really important as you think about your strategy for advocacy for the UPR is how do countries draft recommendations? In other words, how are they creating or deciding what it is they'll say during their 55 seconds or 2 minutes at the floor of the Human Rights Council? And it's usually a three-part, there are usually 3 different components to making that decision. One is the embassy in your country or whatever diplomatic mission there is in your country. So if you're talking about, for example, France, and if you want France to make a recommendation, one of the important voices in France's decision will be the French embassy in your country. So that's one voice because they know what's going on the ground. They're sort of the French embassy staff are the experts about human rights conditions in that country from France's perspective. But the French embassy will also consult with the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs or whatever the equivalent body is in their government in the capital of France. And they will also consult with the country's permanent mission to the United Nations offices in Geneva. In other words, that country also has a diplomatic presence in Geneva that engages specifically with the United Nations there. So those 3 different pieces all work together to draft those recommendations. The embassy is providing the on-the-ground information. The folks in Geneva are the ones who actually read the recommendations and may have a sense of sort of the diplomatic workings on the ground. And then the Ministry of Foreign Affairs will drive sort of the diplomatic motivations behind the recommendations. So if you think about this, these are 3 different points for doing advocacy. So you can lobby and engage in advocacy with the embassies in your country, the embassies of countries that have abolished the death penalty and that are encouraging your country to abolish the death penalty. You can do advocacy with the permanent missions in Geneva via email, or if you have a chance to set up virtual meetings or in-person meetings, and potentially with the ministries of foreign affairs of the various countries, although it's usually difficult to cover that breadth of territory with your lobbying. But if your country has a large diaspora population, that's one way to involve diaspora communities with your lobbying and advocacy as well. So how do you go about this lobbying and advocacy? Well, as I've alluded to, email is a very easy way, and these folks that you're lobbying, they're used to receiving these emails, especially the folks in Geneva, because they're engaged with the UPR 3 times a year, so they know how all of it works. And so they're used to receiving emails to share information about upcoming universal periodic reviews. You can set up meetings, either in person or virtual, one-on-one meetings with the folks at the embassies, with the folks in Geneva, or potentially with the ministries of foreign affairs. You can set up a conference in your capital of your country and invite the embassies to attend that conference. And again, that conference could be a virtual conference as well. If you have the opportunity to go to the Human Rights Council, you could set up a Human Rights Council parallel event or side event, or do a virtual parallel or side event. And the Advocates for Human Rights is busy planning one of those virtual side events for the November 2020 UPR. Also, I've alluded to the NGO based in Geneva called UPR Info, and before each UPR, it holds a pre-session where it invites certain civil society organizations to participate in a 1-hour session for each country and to give a brief presentation of the human rights issues that that organization is concerned about. It's a great audience because all of the diplomats in Geneva are familiar with UPR Info. They like it because they come there, they sit for an hour, they absorb the information, and they take what they want. However, you might not necessarily be the ones who are picked by UPR Info to speak. And UPR Info controls how much you can speak because they have limited time to share among the various civil society organizations they select for a particular country's pre-session. So it's a good opportunity, but it's not available to everyone. Other opportunities for advocacy surround the UPR itself. Even if you're not in Geneva for the UPR, you can watch it live. And it's a great opportunity for advocacy with media and with the public. I personally go on to UN Web TV and watch the UPRs and do live tweeting and get a lot of retweets and likes and all of that. But it's also an opportunity for you to engage with your local media. What you see in the picture here is a partner organization we work with in Morocco called MRA, Mobilizing Rights Associates, and it's an organization that works on a lot of gender-based violence and other women's rights issues. And in 2012, they had a lot of success with the UPR of Morocco. The government of Morocco was eager to be elected to the Human Rights Council, and so it accepted a lot of recommendations on gender-based violence. And Mobilizing Rights Associates scooped the government of Morocco. They had their press release ready to go before the government was even ready to talk to the media about it, and they were able to show in their communications with the media how they had influenced the process, all of the delegates they had lobbied and talked to, and how their what they had lobbied for came out of the mouths of the members of the Human Rights Council and the other people who spoke in the interactive dialogue. So it's a great way to get publicity for your organization and to put pressure on your government to abolish the death penalty and to respect human rights. As I mentioned when we were talking about the cycle, there's also at the very end of the process an opportunity for civil society organizations to speak on the floor of the Human Rights Council. And this is at the adoption of the outcome of the UPR. So typically no more than 10 civil society organizations get the floor to speak. There's not a lot of time. And these organizations have to have special consultative status with the ECOSOC status. But it is an opportunity for civil society organizations to take the floor and to deliver their comments about the UPR mechanism. Here you see from the adoption of the outcomes of the UPR of the Maldives from 2015, an NGO speaker from the Asian Forum for Human Rights and Development delivering a statement. So this is an opportunity to speak, but it's because it occurs at the very end of the process, it's not really an opportunity for civil society organizations to influence the process. It's still an opportunity to take the floor, and that's a good opportunity, but you're not going to change the recommendations or how the government responds to them, because by this point in the cycle, all of that has been decided. So that's the end of our UPR overview. I hope you found it interesting and of use. You see my name, email address, and telephone number up on the screen. And again, I recommend to you our online tool that's available for free download. It's called Human Rights Tools for a Changing World, a step-by-step guide to human rights fact-finding, documentation, and advocacy. So I hope that you will take a look at that resource. And if you have any questions, please reach out to me. And look for me again in another one of these training videos. Thank you very much for your attention.